Welcome to Diagnosing Health Care, a podcast featuring thought-provoking conversations about the latest legal, policy, and regulatory issues in healthcare. While these issues may seem like hurdles, we'll also look at the business opportunities and solutions that exist. Diagnosing Healthcare is brought to you by the healthcare lawyers at Epstein Becker Green, a leading law firm that has more than 40 years' experience serving clients in the healthcare industry nationwide.
Today on Diagnosing Healthcare, we are discussing how the Biden administration has invoked the Defense Production Act to speed up production of vaccines and other critical equipment for the pandemic response. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Bonnie Odom. I'm an attorney in Epstein Becker Green's healthcare and life sciences practice based out of our LA office. President Biden recently announced that the U.S. is on track to have enough COVID-19 vaccines for every U.S. adult by the end of May. The White House has also promised significantly increased domestic production of COVID-19 tests, PPE, and other essential supplies. To make good on these promises, the Biden administration is relying on its authorities under the Defense Production Act. On today's show, we're going to discuss how the administration is using these DPA powers and the challenges and opportunities these actions are likely to present for medical product suppliers. If you like what you hear today, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Healthcare is available wherever you get your podcasts. And we have two guests joining our discussion today. We first have Connie Wilkinson, who is a member of the firm in the healthcare and life sciences practice in the Washington, D.C. office of Epstein Becker Green, where she advises drug and device manufacturers on pricing and reimbursement policy, commercial pricing, federal healthcare and health benefits program issues, and contracting strategies. Connie, thanks for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Bonnie. Looking forward to the discussion today.
Great. And we also have Neil Di Spirito here today. Neil is a member of the firm in the healthcare and life sciences practice in the Washington, D.C. and St. Petersburg offices of Epstein Becker Green. He brings over 2 decades of experience counseling life science company clients on a broad range of regulatory matters. And you may remember him from our previous podcast episode on the reshoring of U.S. drug manufacturing activities, which actually ties in quite nicely with our discussion today. Welcome back, Neil, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me again, Bonnie. I enjoyed it last time, and I'm sure it'll be a productive and interesting discussion today.
Defense Production Act, or the DPA as we'll refer to it here, is not a new law. It was enacted back in 1950 in response to the start of the Korean War. And put simply, the law gives the president broad authority to control domestic industries during wartime or in the face of other national emergencies, such as a pandemic. Among other things, it allows the president to direct private domestic companies to accept or prioritize certain orders from the federal government so that the government gets its order first. It also allows the president to deploy federal funding. It can do this through loans, guarantees, or purchase commitments. Deploy this funding to finance the production of certain essential supplies. To date, the Biden administration has invoked the DPA in a number of ways. It has been used to ensure vaccine manufacturers have access to equipment needed to ramp up production and to invest in domestic manufacturing of essential supplies, including at-home COVID-19 tests, surgical gloves, and the like. And reliance on the DPA is expected to continue as the administration moves forward with operationalizing its pandemic response. So Connie, we know that the DPA allows the president to require companies to prioritize federal government contracts. Meaning, regardless of what other orders that company might have in its queue, it has to ensure that the government gets its order first. So if we consider a hypothetical medical product manufacturer and the manufacturer receives one of these rated orders, what steps do they need to take? Do they have to accept the rated order? Can you walk us through that scenario?
Sure. Bonnie, generally they do have to accept it, assuming that the order is for a product that they typically produce, unless they know they cannot produce the supply in the time frame the government's requiring. Rated orders are considered mandatory. They're not just offers that a contractor can take or leave, because the government has already made the judgment that the supplies the agency is ordering are essential for national security and that they can't secure sufficient supplies without invoking the DPA. And that's why rated orders are relatively rare overall and have typically been used for medical equipment and and weapons, at times cybersecurity, and in the healthcare arena for things like antidotes to bioweapons. That was before the pandemic. Now we think of the DPA in the context of ventilators and test kits and most recently vaccines. And we've seen the government including language in some of the recent contracts for things like the rapid development of diagnostics or RADx grants for test kits, where they include a clause that is essentially a placeholder for them to issue an order under the DPA as needed. They are certainly anticipating that this will be the case with some of these supplies.
Right. And with regard to those contracts, or when the rated orders come in, let's say, does the manufacturer have any standing to negotiate the price or any other terms of those orders?
There is some room for negotiation in terms of how a company should approach this. The first steps they should take when they receive a rated order. The company needs first to step back and investigate and plan first to see whether it has any other rated orders that would take precedence over this one, because even among rated orders, some have higher priority than others. And that might include discussions with business partners, for example, if they have some sort of contract manufacturing relationship or critical supplies, they may need to speak to a supplier. As you've noted, their commercial orders can't take precedence. There's the potential for another competing rated order. Then they have to determine whether it's possible for them to ramp up manufacturing capacity or reprogram a manufacturing line to be able to increase the production of this particular ordinance timeframe. But they can, if they're unable to produce the products on the date the government's looking for, they can try to negotiate with the government on the schedule to see if they can move the delivery date to the earliest possible date that they would be able to produce the product. And, we are aware that there are times when the government uses, strong arm tactics, some coercion in these circumstances due to their perception of the urgency of the need. In terms of cost, there are requirements that a company cannot discriminate against rated orders. And part of how that is interpreted is as a requirement that the supplies be produced or be sold to the government at market prices. There can't be a premium price charged for products under a rated order.
And you mentioned some strong arm tactics that the government might use. Are there penalties that the government could apply to these rated orders if the manufacturer doesn't perform?
Well, there are penalties actually if the contractor refuses to accept a rated order, or if they avoid accepting a rated order through, for example, false statements, things like that. I mean, there can be fines, there can be imprisonment, and then under things like the False Claims or False Statements Act, there can be other monetary penalties that are imposed upon contractors. I think in the context of a contractor failing to perform within the required timeframes, it's more likely that unless there were some sign of bad faith involved in that issue, it would be handled more as a contract administration issue where the contractor would be required to notify the government as soon as they possibly could that they were going to fall short of that delivery date and that the parties would try to work something out. I mean, one of the other things to remember about rated orders is that they're required flow downs under the contract from the government. And so if part of what's causing the delay at the prime contractor level, the top company, is that they're unable to get needed supplies or things like that, they can use their rated order to push down that priority to their key suppliers. And so sometimes if it's not a production capacity issue, if it's more a critical component or ingredient issue, they may be able to use the rated order themselves as something of a cudgel in order to get the priority that they need from their suppliers.
Right. So it sounds like manufacturers that have had government contracts before won't really be caught off guard by these rated orders necessarily, but maybe for newcomers to the space who haven't had experience with government contracts, are there any specific compliance considerations that those newcomers might want to keep in mind?
If a company has never been a government contractor before, it's important that they understand that a government order will likely include some of the standard terms and conditions that they've never seen before, but that typically apply to government contractors. And even if it's a contract for a commercial item, there's a short list of clauses from the Federal Acquisition Regulation that would typically be included. And these are driven by other statutory requirements. And again, since the rating itself is a flow down requirement, a company can find themselves subject to these requirements because they're a supplier or subcontractor to a company that receives a rated order. So for these companies, these requirements would seem even more out of the blue. So the companies would need to come up to speed on some of these specific government obligations if they've only been in the commercial market before. There'll be something of a learning curve in figuring out what those obligations are and how they need to comply with them.
So to sum up there, rated orders are not optional. They'll definitely require some focused attention and planning to prioritize next steps and put them into motion. And for companies without federal government contracting experience, there'll be some catch-up work to do to make sure they're well informed on the requirements and to make sure they're meeting those requirements. Neil, sticking with this rated order scenario, what impact could fulfilling these government orders have on the typical day-to-day operations of a medical product manufacturer?
Thanks, Bonnie. I believe that we have to digress a little bit because while American domestic manufacturers do have to comply with these laws, foreign manufacturers who do not have a U.S. presence may not have to. And the impact that will make on day-to-day operations is, say you have an API supplier, active pharmaceutical ingredient, and it's a company in China or India, or there used to be many in Italy at one time, and they do not have American contacts. In that case, passing down the sub order to them or the commercial order from the main manufacturer who got the initial order may not have the impact that it has on an American manufacturer. So what happens in day to day is that you may need significant API to produce certain drugs, say, or components for medical devices under the DPA, and those might not be available, and DPA can do little really to push those forward. Now, we do have treaties with many countries like the European Union, Britain at this point separately, Japan, many places in the globe that will honor DPA orders in some way or another. But in essence, many of the foreign suppliers without a U.S. presence, they don't have a U.S. company here, are not subject to this. So that could make a big difference in the day-to-day type of occupation. There are other options that come into play on this as well. I think one of the things that you need to note is that the DPA doesn't supersede things like pharmaceutical GMPs or medical GMPs. Basically, you can't use lesser products or lesser quality products in the production of the products than you would normally use. So there would have to be a negotiation with government if, in fact, you can't get this particular supply of components or API, and you needed to use a lesser inert ingredient or a different active ingredient than has been approved by the FDA. And that would take interagency negotiations. These things all come into play. You get into things like, you could get into potential shortages of other products.
Yeah, Neil, could you tell us a little bit more about that? It seems like the rated orders are helpful in accomplishing what they set out to accomplish and kind of getting priority supplies produced as quickly as possible. But of course, there'll also be some unforeseen consequences downstream. What can you tell us about the drug shortages? Where do you see that going? Do you see more of those in our future?
At this point, we haven't experienced that, but certainly when COVID-19 tests were required And the government was asking what could happen is that if all of the latex is required for, say, COVID-19 testing, there could be shortage of latex for other tests. So that would leave you in these type of situations. I think that's a fairly good example of what you would see there. And quite honestly, as Connie mentioned, and I think she did a wonderful job in making this point, and that is that, if you disrupt the orders of other commercial suppliers, basically the government is not concerned with that. Now, that's not to say that if you disrupted the supply of essential drugs, that they wouldn't get involved and try to work this out under the DPA. But basically, if you're strictly interpreting the DPA, what you're finding is that if there are shortages in other products, the government considers that a natural consequence or result.
Yeah, so going back to something you said, so if you're a company who received one of these rated orders and your other customers who have had their orders disrupted in order for the government's order to take priority, is there any protection from contractual liability for companies fulfilling the rated order?
Yes, companies, there are protections for liabilities that are contained in the DPA, okay? And I think that would be a whole separate show as to what those are, but basically 50 USC 4557, which is a section of the DPA that deals with this, says that no person shall be held liable for damages or penalties for any act or failure to act resulting directly or indirectly from compliance with this rule or regulation pursuant to DPA. In essence, if your commercial pieces are held up by DPA, that appears to be a defense towards breach of contract claims, et cetera, because you were ordered by the government to put those in other places.
Right. And companies also might have some protection under the Public Readiness and Emergency Preparedness Act, which gives liability immunity to certain companies that develop, manufacture, and distribute medical countermeasures to address COVID-19.
Right. And I think the point there is that those protections are built in to the COVID-19 legislations. I think the point we're trying to make here is that commercial orders not protected by the COVID-19 legislation can be protected by the DPA. So in other words, if your commercial orders are not rated orders, then in essence, you're supplying government. If all the cardboard you have to use or all the pill bottles or all the vials, glass vials you have to use for injectables to fulfill the government's order, then that's what has to be done. Now, is the government unreasonable? Would they say, we're going to take all the vials and you can't have insulin? I doubt it. I mean, I'm sure there would be some accommodation there. But theoretically, if you take a look at the DPA and interpret it textually, so to speak, that would be what's happening.
And our rated order hypothetical touched on a number of the challenges a medical product manufacturer might face as a result of DPA actions taken by the government. But on the other hand, we should also consider the different opportunities that the DPA may present for medical product manufacturers. Connie, what do you think some of those opportunities might be?
Well, I think there are circumstances in which for some companies, these could be really lucrative or critical business opportunities. And, there is authority under the DPA for there to be incentives for the domestic industrial base to expand production capacity and supply of critical materials and products. So, what would some of these incentives look like? They can include things like purchase commitments. Normally, the government cannot commit to purchase levels more than a small guaranteed minimum under contract. So this could be an opportunity to secure a higher quantity commitment or guarantee that could help secure a company's financial position. In addition to that, there are some other types of incentives that are available, both under the law and through some of the COVID legislation as well, and the relief legislation. These include things like loans or loan guarantees, as well as grants or investments incorporating new state-of-the-art technology, particularly into the manufacturing process. There's a There's a whole program around advanced manufacturing technologies specific to trying to increase the production capacity and supply, but it involves adoption of a number of new cutting edge sorts of technologies. So it's attracting a lot of interest. And I know that FDA is involved in a collaboration with the National Institute of Standards and Technologies as part of that effort. So you can see that there are lots of different ways in which a particular company, if they either have a new idea that could fall under one of these types of development programs, or if they simply have a vision for their manufacturing facility that could benefit from support for the financial investment to incorporate that new idea, the more efficient technology, those types of things, this could be a real possibility for a company to make a step forward.
Neil, any thoughts?
Well, I think this has been a huge boon to business. They had technologies that were coming along nicely that would have been used for other type of things, but in this circumstance, all of the capacity was used to satisfy the very large demand from the government. And I think on that point, I think it's important to remember that the smaller companies are impacted by this much more than the larger companies. Granted, I'm sure it's a nice bit of, sales and revenues for the larger companies. But for smaller companies where this is their only product line or one of a few, these government contracts are certainly a boon to their business.
I wanted to tie in our discussion today back into the reshoring conversation we had a few months back, because the efforts under the DPA to boost domestic production of essential supplies, such as surgical gloves and other PPE, seem to really build off federal initiatives that were launched by the Trump administration last year to bring production of drugs and other medical supplies back to the U.S. The manufacturing of these products has gradually moved abroad in the last couple of decades. These initiatives, of course, were prompted by the pandemic, which highlighted the fragility of our pharmaceutical supply chain and supply chain for other products, and the risk of the U.S. relying on foreign manufacturers so heavily to supply these products to U.S. patients. And in some respects, President Biden has picked up where the last administration left off. There is use of the DPA to increase domestic production. Biden also issued a recent executive order directing a government review of international supply chains and potential U.S. vulnerabilities in certain key industries, including pharmaceuticals and computer chips, among a few others. Neil, how do you see the administration's use of the DPA intersecting with this broader effort to bring the production of drugs and other medical products back to the U.S.?
Good question, Bonnie, and it does tie in with our previous podcast. I don't want to get too deeply into our previous podcast, but I think the summary of our previous podcast was that the U.S. on its own will never be the cheapest producer of low-tech medical equipment or of API, for that matter. The thing that really kept U.S. manufacturing in the United States for both finished product and API was really the Pacific Basin Act that allowed for the tax incentives in Puerto Rico and other areas of the Pacific Basin. Once that was removed, it was much more cost effective to source the API and drugs from other places in the globe, where environmental laws are lessened, where labor is less expensive, where there are less regulations on the production of these different products. And I think we mentioned it, at least I touched on it at the top of the broadcast, and that was that the DPA has very little effect on a foreign producer with no American presence. So in order to assure that supply, as a nation would probably have to look to do something to supplement domestic production. And, certainly one of the ways they did it effectively in the 1990s until the law sunsetted at some point was to allow tax breaks and benefits in order to offset the higher production cost of U.S. production. From that perspective, I believe in fulfilling what the Biden administration is continuing to do, what the previous administration had started, in certain areas, and that is to create an uninterrupted American domestic supply chain. You would have to do some reshoring of manufacturing, and it would only really cost effectively be done with something similar to the Pacific Basin Act or some such similar legislation that would grant tax incentives and incentives for building plants, capital equipment, et cetera.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be a continued push to reshore production of certain products, and also recognize that there will be challenges in trying to accomplish that. Most obviously, as Neil mentioned, the cost. And I think that's something that current and future administrations will need to grapple with, and perhaps consider some of these more creative potential solutions to drive forward this effort, such as tax incentives or other solutions. So in closing, I wanted to raise the fact that the Biden administration had recently relied on the Defense Production Act to facilitate this partnership between two large pharmaceutical companies to help speed up vaccine production. And this is somewhat unusual way to use the DPA, but it seems like it's productive and will help accelerate vaccine production. Are there other ways you think the Biden administration in the coming months or coming years might continue to rely on the DPA?
There will continue to be opportunities, unique opportunities at this time for that type of collaboration. I know that there is some protection under the DPA for companies who do that, who might normally be considered about some sort of antitrust implications. So it's, in that sense, the DPA can be kind of a useful shield for some of this, rather than just the hammer we might think of it as being in some other circumstances. I think there are a lot of exciting possibilities for collaboration on companies, both in terms of drug development and production, for moving things in the right direction, not only for drugs that are needed in the pandemic, but really moving forward. I mean, we've seen some of the collaboration already on some of the higher priced drugs, whether those are oncology or other disease states. And I think that would be, or is really, a very exciting possibility in the pharmaceutical industry, as companies are trying to figure out how to be able to support the development, even under the ever constraining pricing issues and the concerns about the higher cost drugs, the spiraling costs of healthcare generally. I would like to think that there will be more of those, that there will be opportunities for advancing both discoveries and manufacturing techniques through some other of these collaborations that can really take place within the framework of the DPA.
I think we're going to see this with the variants that are out there. These vaccines are going to have to be tweaked going forward, and we're going to have enough supply of the tweaked vaccine for boosters as these variants occur. And that's where I think you're going to see further use of the DPA.
Well, Connie and Neil, thank you so much for joining the discussion today. And to our guests, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the show. Diagnosing Health Care is available wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening to Diagnosing Health Care. For show notes on today's episode, additional episodes, and more insights on trending issues in healthcare, please visit diagnosinghealthcare.com and be sure to subscribe on your preferred platform. The Employment Law This Week and Diagnosing Healthcare podcasts are presented by Epstein Becker Green, PC. All rights are reserved. This audio recording includes information about legal issues and legal developments. Such materials are for informational purposes only and may not reflect the most current legal developments. These informational materials are not intended and should not be taken as legal advice on any particular set of facts or circumstances, and these materials are not a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship has been created by this audio recording. This audio recording may be considered attorney advertising in some jurisdictions under the applicable law and ethical rules. The determination of the need for legal services and the choice of a lawyer are extremely important decisions and should not be based solely upon advertisements or self-proclaimed expertise. No representation is made that the quality of the legal services to be performed is greater than the quality of legal services performed by other lawyers.